Welcome to Relationscapes, the podcast where we explore gender, sexuality, race, and relationships in order to make the world better for everybody. I'm journalist Blair Hodges in Salt Lake City, and our guide in this episode is the critically acclaimed author, Melissa Febos.
I thought, I have a messed up relationship to relationships. I don't know how I got it. I really need to change myself. And it was really quite shocking. So many people were like, tell me more. And I thought, oh my God, I am not alone in this. So I'm going to lay out what I have learned through the experience of celibacy so that other people can find it as a touchstone if they are already having this experience.
Melissa Febos found herself in back-to-back-to-back relationships, always seeking but never finding the kind of lasting connection and satisfaction that she so badly thirsted for. Partners hurt her and she hurt partners until drastic times called for drastic measures. And just as she had done earlier with drugs and alcohol, she determined to go love sober. A 3-month experiment, complete celibacy. But 3 months was never going to be enough, as she explains in her latest book, The Dry Season, a memoir of pleasure in a year without sex. Award-winning author Melissa Febos joins us to talk about it right now. Melissa Febos, welcome to Relationscapes.
Thanks for having me.
We're talking about the book, The Dry Season, and when I first saw your book, I thought maybe it was like a writer had thought up this fun experiment to try. I don't know if you've heard of Rachel Held Evans did this Year of Biblical Womanhood.
Yeah, I've heard of that book.
Yeah, so I was like, are you doing Year of Celibate Womanhood? This is going to be a fun book project and stuff. But you say it was actually the words you use are a biological imperative to try celibacy out. So talk about that.
I wish it had just been sort of a fun idea.
Yeah.
I wish that all of my books had just been fun book ideas instead of crucibles of actual living. But unfortunately, that's not how I live. I tend to sort of, as I describe at pretty great length in this book, I have extremist tendencies. I don't live lightly. I tend to sort of rocket in a certain direction until I hit a wall, and then I need to make a big decision and overhaul my whole way of thinking or living or being. And this was not an exception. It didn't occur to me to write about it until many years afterward. At the time that I was living it, I just was coming off of 20 years of nonstop romantic relationships, which had culminated in the worst one, a relationship that had kind of ruined my life, or I ruined my life while I was in it. And on the other side of it, I thought, damn, I should be better at this after 20 years of logging my 10,000 hours. And so I thought, all right, let me step back and take a little break and see what's going on here.
Later on, then you decide to write about it. And looking at the back cover, the pull quote that they chose, it makes the book sound kind of super horny.
Yeah.
It says, I've been thinking of this time as a dry season, but it had been the most fertile of my life since childhood. I had run dry when I spent that vitality in worship of lovers. In celibacy, I felt more wet than I had in years. So I was like, okay, is this...
Yeah.
And I know publishers are going to publish, right? So...
Yeah, I think they were a little worried about publishing a book about celibacy, especially I think with the title The Dry Season, that they were going to be like, oh, nobody really wants to read about a dry season. And because the book is pretty sensual and I think fun and funny and surprising. I think they wanted to add a crude encouragement for readers who might be turned off by the title and the ostensible subject matter, which is this is my 5th book. I know what publishers do. So I was like, all right, I get it.
Yeah, it's super titillating. The book has some titillating things in it, but it's more, like you said, it's very sensuous, and it's about expanding other aspects of your personhood beyond sex. Not to say that sex wasn't still important or that you were still reckoning with it, but Your original plan actually wasn't a year even, right? You were
Hmm.
looking at 3 months. So you kind of gave us a little bit of the background about where you are, but you didn't mention Best X. So let's kind of go to this moment about why you chose to go 3 months, what had happened with Best X, is who you call them in the
Yeah,
book, and give us that bit of the story.
sure. Happy to. Yeah, it's just, yeah, it's actually even more pitiful that it was only 3 months. But which for me was a really radical shift. And, I was being realistic with myself. So what happened was I was in my, I guess it was like my very late 20s or early 30s. No, it was my late 20s. I got into what was really sort of the healthiest relationship of my life with an older woman who was also an artist, and we had a really lovely relationship. And then she had a health crisis, and I basically became a caretaker for a couple of years, and it was a pretty excoriating experience. I mean, certainly most of all for her, but also, at the age of like 29 or 30, I was not prepared to undergo that kind of experience. And I rose to it as best I could, which
Mm-hmm.
was imperfect. And
Well, I mean, caregiving has like emotional and physical components
it
to it too,
really
depending
does.
on what the person's going through.
Yeah, and we moved out of the city. I learned how to conduct medical procedures that
Mm-hmm.
only citizens in a country with a totally corrupt insurance system would ever have to learn how to do at home.
Yeah.
And at the end of it, I really sort of felt done and didn't know what to do. My partner was improving, but in small ways.
Mm.
Um, and then this sort of transition, for lack of a better word, unfolded that I was pretty familiar with, where I sort of wanted out of a relationship. I didn't know how to do it. I felt sort of bound to the person. I didn't want to hurt them. I didn't want to abandon them. And so I just sort of stayed and kind of emotionally and mentally checked out.
Mm.
And then eventually, after many months, my interest was piqued by another person, and I ended up kissing that person. And I didn't have it
Mm-hmm.
in me to conduct an affair or anything like that. So I told my partner right away, and my relationship exploded.
Mm.
And then I was like, honestly, sadly, my thought was, well, it can't get worse than this. Like, I'm coming off of pretty much the hard, possibly, arguably the hardest 2 years of my life.
Right.
I feel totally depleted, just like mentally, spiritually, financially cashed. And now I've had this like really ugly breakup where I was like very clearly the villain.
Mm.
And I'm going to just sort of recuperate.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of recuperating, I jumped headlong into another relationship, and which turned out to be the most harrowing ever. A truly devastating relationship where I had been sober for 10 years at this point, clean and
Mm-hmm.
sober from drugs and alcohol. And I basically sort of treated this relationship like I had drugs and alcohol in my 20s.
Yeah,
And,
what were the similarities there? Like, what would you say the crossover was?
I just chose that relationship and that person, even though the relationship was incredibly tumultuous. We fought all the time. It was very possessive and like really a sort of
Hmm.
degraded model of relationship from anything I'd ever experienced, like pretty toxic relationship, pretty manipulative.
Like a lot of jealousy and
A lot
control
of
and
jealousy
stuff?
and control, like, on both sides. It was not a healthy
Hmm.
relationship, but I prioritized it over all of my other relationships, over
Mm-hmm.
my physical health. I was constantly, like, flying across the country, driving long distances. My partner didn't live in New York. She lived, like, 3,000 miles away. She was
Oh, there's
also.
that one
Yeah.
story you tell where you like drove all the way out there and it was like a complete
Oh
disaster.
my
You
god. I mean, there
like she
was.
wanted you. She's basically like, "Come to me right now," and you're like, "It's the middle of the night." Okay, I'm coming.
Yeah, it was like and that was so typical. There were, like, literally more instances like that than I could possibly count. Like, the
Wow.
whole relationship was like
Jeez.
that. It was like, "Prove you love me by doing
Yeah.
this crazy thing that hurts you." Um, it was awful. It was really, really
It
awful.
kind of reminded me of that lady, the astronaut who like drove across
With
the
the
country.
diaper
Except she
on,
she she drove to kill
she
someone,
drove
but
to kill
you drove
someone.
to prove your
I drove
love.
to prove my love and was incrementally killing myself, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it really was like, my mother's a psychotherapist. I've been in recovery for 10
Yeah.
years. I've been in therapy most of my life.
Yeah.
Even as it was happening, there was this, like, part of me that was like, "What on earth is going on?" Like, what is like, I
Wow.
literally I was deranged. I was deranged for 2 years. I can't even believe it went on for that long.
So there was a part of you observing it during that time. You were sort of like, I mean, you were obviously neck deep in it. That's where you really were. But at the same time, you did have a little bit of
Yeah.
distance enough to say, like, this is nuts.
Yeah, I knew it was absolutely nuts, but there was I mean, it really was second only to my experience of drug addiction, like the depths of drug addiction. It was proof to me that it was possible to entertain multiple consciousnesses at a single time. Like, it's really a part of me was absolutely all in on this relationship. It felt like my life depended on making it work. I was also telling myself, and my partner was also telling me a story of like this kind of scary fairy tale-ish, like not Americanized fairy tales, but like scary Grimm's fairy
Yeah, the
tales.
ones where
Like
everybody
Hans
dies
Christian
and stuff,
Andersen, where
yeah.
everybody cuts their feet off and gets their eyes pecked out by
Yeah, the
crows.
Little Mermaid,
Yeah,
like,
like that
dies
kind of
by
fairy tale.
suicide at the end.
Exactly, where it was just like, this is what true love is. It ravages you, it ruins your life, you put it before everything else. It was contrary to every sort of like, insight about healthy relationship I'd ever gleaned from all my years in it, and I was just like, there was like a very young, undeveloped part of me that was like, "Yes, this is the dream," right? And then I think,
Yeah.
I do identify as an addict, and I think there's a biological
Yeah.
component. I think that, like, however you want to explain that,
Yeah.
I have
I thought you treaded that carefully too, by the way, to not like necessarily full on equate it, because addiction's it
Yeah,
really is kind
thank
of its own
you.
thing. But to point out the parallels there
Mhm.
really mattered. I liked that you were careful with that.
Thank you so much. I worked really hard to try to thread the needle there because it
hmm
definitely, like, locked into that addictive part of my brain that
hmm
can take sort of anything that feels good and turn it into a battering ram that I use on myself.
Yeah.
And I certainly did that with that relationship.
Battering ram.
Mhm.
Perfect. That reminds me of there's this great section in the book where you talk about Wile E. Coyote.
Yeah.
Speaking of battering rams, so I thought it'd be cool to have you read this section on page 155.
Happy to. I love that section, if I'm allowed to say that.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna hold the book over here so that I can get at
Okay.
the microphone. As a kid, the only time I was allowed to binge on television was Saturday morning cartoons. My favorites were Tex Avery's Droopy Dog and Sexy Red Hot Riding Hood. But of the better known characters, I had a soft spot for Wile E. Coyote. Coyote was the hapless protagonist of his skits, always trying to trap the smug roadrunner and always failing. Each of his Rube Goldberg contraptions backfired comically, and I found pathos in the grim resignation with which he opened his parasol as a boulder hurtled toward him. He was the rapacious predator and also the underdog, the chump, the loser. Partly my sympathies were triggered because I rooted for the loser in every game, regardless of what team I claimed. I also related to Coyote. He looked like an absolute junkie, rangy and ragged, bloodshot eyes and greasy fur, strung out on his desire for Roadrunner. He was the hatcher of half-baked plans, a chronic underestimator, a real tweaker. Why didn't he eat something else? I understood why. Obsession made us stupid. Once that drive ignited, reason became a stranger. There was only hunger and new ways to chase it. I marveled at Coyote's ingenuity because I understood the relentless imagination of those whose perspective had narrowed straw thin. Coyote was a hungry ghost, dying over and over. Chuck Jones, who created the character for Warner Brothers in 1949, made him a sick and sorry-looking skeleton based on Mark Twain's description of a coyote in his 1872 book of travel writing, Roughing It. Twain's coyote was a living, breathing allegory of want. He is always hungry. Once, walking laps around LA's Silver Lake Reservoir, I spotted a coyote jogging along the inside of the chain link that surrounded the water. He must have gotten in through a hole in the fence. Lean and haunted, he stared out at us passing humans like, how did I get into this hungry cage and how do I get out? I had to turn away. I described myself as a gremlin to my therapist, but the figure of a coyote is more accurate. A gremlin was a monster, but Wile E. Coyote, though a kind of villain, was also a slave, in bondage to his obsession. We associate villainy with power, but it is more often characterized by desperation. We are all capable of becoming predators if we get hungry enough. To label the drive solely as one of addiction was reductive, though, and inexact. I believed that some biological quirk was its likely origin, be it a serotonin deficit or an inheritance of intergenerational trauma, but ultimately it didn't matter, so long as I understood it wasn't a moral failing or a life sentence. Addiction could be a consequence of it, and certainly it could lead, and had, to moral failures, but the drive itself was something else, more capacious in its potential. The conditions that cause a tornado are not a tornado nor its wreckage. They are power inchoate. The essay I had probably assigned to students most over my years of teaching was Annie Dillard's Living Like Weasels. The magic of the essay is that it has almost no narrative. Dillard simply makes eye contact with a weasel one day on her usual walk around a pond. If you and I looked at each other that way, she explains, our skulls would split and drop to our shoulders. The rest of the essay is ostensibly an ode to the weasel, its black hole of eyes, but really a bit of glorious thinking on instinct and how best to live. We can live any way we want, she promises. People take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, even of silence, by choice. The thing is to stalk your calling in a certain skilled and supple way, to locate the most tender and live spot and plug into that pulse. This is yielding, not fighting. A weasel doesn't attack anything. A weasel lives as he's meant to, yielding at every moment to the perfect freedom of single necessity. I had read the essay probably 30 times, and I always thought first that yielding at every moment to single necessity could be a description of bondage to addiction, poverty, survival under domination. Coyote yielded at every moment to his single necessity, and so had I as an active addict. So had I as a lover, prioritized my limerent obsessions, no matter how fleeting, over everything else I loved. But Dillard wasn't describing the addict. She described the artist, I thought, though it could be anyone, choosing the given with a fierce and pointed will. The key was choice. The difference between bondage to a single necessity and the perfect freedom of one was agency. Once obsession locked in, I lost the power of choice. But before that, I still had it, my perfect freedom.
That's Melissa Febos reading from the book The Dry Season, a memoir of pleasure in a year without sex. Did you kind of get inspired by Annie Dillard's essay? She talks about vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Was that an ingredient floating around in your mind when you kind of decided to take up the celibacy thing? Or is that something you're like, oh, hey, yeah, she talked about that too?
Not consciously, but I think that the thing that attracts me to that essay and the thing that attracted me to the project of celibacy are the same part. Right? That there is a part of me that is, first of all, interested in sort of the other side of extremism. Like, I'm going to go all in on my indulgences, but I also want to go all in on my asceticism or my deprivations. Like that, that sort of going all in on something, or even the simplicity of like that perfect freedom of a single necessity made so much sense to me, right? And I think that
it really, like a lot of questions are answered just by having that already. You
totally
spend a lot less mental time making decisions.
I mean, even the addict stuff aside, like I'm a Libra, I see all sides of everything. I could really get into like a kind of agonized spot over a restaurant menu, deciding what to order, like.
Have you heard of The Paradox of Choice, that book?
No, I haven't.
Ooh, it is so good. Basically, really quick, his argument is, and it's based in research, is that the more choices we're presented with, the less satisfaction we report and experience after the fact, because we second guess ourselves. So he's like, if people had 20 different pairs of shoes to choose from, and then they chose one, and then they reported how satisfied they were with those shoes, they're much more likely to be less satisfied than if they chose between two pairs.
That's so interesting.
So it sounds like you've experienced that, the paradox of
totally.
choice.
I think I might have actually heard that guy on Radio Lab or something one time, but
I think that's where I originally heard him, yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense, and Diller was onto that, right? It's like, that's why it's a freedom. It's like
Hmm.
our mind cognitively is just tends toward deliberation if we're given too many
Yeah,
options. We're not meant to have too many options. Capitalism has, it's like, total it's such a mind fuck, and so,
it is.
um, yeah, I think I love the simplicity of the idea of sort of getting up every day and being like, "These are the shoes
Right.
I wear, this is the shirt I wear, everything is in service to the one thing that I live for," right? Which is a good description of a nun's life, actually.
Yeah, yeah,
As well as a
yeah.
devoted artist or a devoted anything, right?
Yeah, so you're going to take your own personal like vow of celibacy. The maelstrom finally screeches to a halt. It blows up. You're ready to separate from that, as
Mhm.
you describe in the book. But even after that, you still have like 5 quick, brief entanglements, and I love how you describe them as like the last handfuls of popcorn when you already decided to stop. I so related to
Just one more.
that.
Just one I've already
Yeah,
got it in
I'm
my hand. I
done.
might as well just
Yeah.
yeah, one last one. I was like that with TV as a kid. I'm still kinda like that with candy. It's just
Yeah.
there's an inertia to my appetites for certain things. It's hard to work around.
It was nice though, because it gave you an opportunity to like reflect back on what happened in those situations. Because what you ended up deciding to do was kind of write this personal inventory out. You're like, I'm going to write my personal relationship history and try to figure out what the patterns are and like what's going wrong here. And so you had those 5 quick ones right away that you could just
Mhm.
sort of dig into. And then you hit your first big test,
Mhm.
your first big temptation, just 6 weeks in.
Mhm.
And this is, you go to LA. It's
Mhm.
probably like a conference or something, I assume,
It was
right?
a conference.
You're at a hotel room and someone invites you in.
Mhm. Yeah, and I went. It was
You went
I
in.
went in, which was it was one of those moments, like, as a memoirist, it's so interesting because you're basically sort of building this little diorama of the past and then
Hmm.
reenacting your own choices. But now you are divested from the stakes of those scenes. And so it's really obvious. It's like watching a little TV show of your life that you're writing yourself. The most like agonizing slash entertaining TV shows are the ones where you're like, no, don't go there. What are
Yeah.
you doing?
You
Don't go in the
idiot.
basement.
Yeah.
Of course he's down there. And this was one of those moments writing the book where I was like, "Oh, man." I
So
mean, not even
obvious.
writing the book, just writing the inventory, where I was like, "Oh god." Clearly, it was like, "Don't do it. Don't get in the elevator. Don't go to the hallway. Definitely
Mm-hmm.
don't go into the hotel room."
Hmm.
But and so it was with equal parts, like, regret, dread, judgment, shame,
Mm.
but also kind of a new feeling, which was like a kind of like compassion or I don't know, a kind of like agonized tenderness where it's like, oh man, you were really powerless. Like you knew
Hmm.
you didn't want to, you knew that you shouldn't, you knew it wasn't the right thing, but the incredible gravity of another person's desire or expectation was so
Hmm.
powerful. It's like, wow. It was a little glimpse into sort of all of the ways that I had been, or at least felt powerless in my relationships. Because this wasn't even someone that I was in like a
Right.
committed relationship with. It was someone I had
Right.
had like a kind of mixed dalliance with, who I really respected as a person, but I didn't.
This is the person you were had more of like a text
Yeah, like I
flirtation
didn't
with,
really
right? Yeah.
want to be in a relationship with them. I really had just wanted to be friends with them, and
Yeah.
uh,
Well, you introduced this idea of pity too, or sympathy.
mhm.
Like this was really clarifying to me, where you're like, okay, I was there, because I'm thinking like, why didn't she just get out of there? Is she just like wanting to have sex? Is that what it is? And it really wasn't. And a lot of it had to do with not wanting. I mean, she was basically begging you, and you didn't want to like hurt her feelings.
Yeah.
And so there was this like sense of obligation and people pleasing that
Yep.
was a component of your ongoing sexual experiences. That it was really clarifying
Yeah.
to see
It
that.
was clarifying for me as well. It really had not been visible to me. I mean, I had sort of
Hmm.
thrown that word around, right? Like, I'm on the internet. I've been to therapy. I know what people pleasing
Yeah.
is. And I had been like, oh, yeah, like, as I say yes when I want to say no sometimes, like everybody. Um,
Sure.
but it's different between being like, yeah, I guess I'll do that at work, and then walking into a hotel room with someone who wants to have
Hmm.
sex with you and you don't want to have sex with them. It's like a very different situation. The stakes
Yeah.
psychologically are a bit higher there. Um,
Yeah.
and I just hadn't realized how huge a factor that had been in my decision making, right? And so
Hmm.
how much of my relationship history, my sex life had been sort of governed by this sort of irresistibility of meeting other people's expectations or wants,
Hmm.
even with women. I had thought, "Oh, that's like a heterosexual thing," right? No, it was a me thing. It was just a
Right.
thing that I did in relationships, and I
Hmm.
did also do it at work and sometimes do it in my friendships or in my family,
Hmm.
but I hadn't really
Yeah.
seen it in this area, which was also really helpful and weirdly empowering when I was making the inventory because I had been like, how do I end up in these relationships? How have I ended up here? And here I had sort of like gotten the magnifying glass over a
Yeah.
dynamic I hadn't seen before. And I thought, oh, here's what's happening. This is part of what I'm doing. This is something I can change. Right.
Right. And you got out of that room. You
Hmm.
got out of the hotel room and learned a powerful lesson that when push came to shove,
Hmm.
here was proof that you could say
I
no.
could.
You could do
Yeah.
it.
It was
Yeah.
a real departure, I think, because in the
Mm.
past, it sort of shed a spotlight on all of these past experiences I'd had where I hadn't left the room, at least not before doing something that I think was probably psychologically harmful to me, definitely was.
Yeah.
And in that case, I think because I had begun this endeavor into celibacy and really admitted to myself in a really lucid way, I don't want to do this. I want to step away from this. I want to take a break because I had sort of set these parameters for myself and had a deadline. I was like, no, I mean, like, I am a very type A. I'm a good student. I meet a deadline, right? So I was like, no, I
Yeah.
can't. I have a deadline.
Yeah.
I have to get out of this room. And it was so hard. And I did it. And I thought, wow, that is a real departure from what I've done in the past. And I can now, it just instantly sort of revised my conception of my whole history.
Yeah. And we get to see that. I mean, you wrote it down and now you've edited it and kind of
Hmm.
dispersed it throughout the book. And as you're approaching some of your earliest relationships, like back when you were a teenager, you kind of started to relax a bit because you're like, how bad could it be? I was a kid and it was probably like some funny things that happened. But your expectations were upended there and you actually had to work through a lot
Yep.
more with those early relationships than you'd expected to.
Yeah, I really did. I mean, and this is also in hindsight, really logical. Like, of course, I didn't like start this like destructive pattern in my adulthood. It came from somewhere, right?
Yeah. And you say you had a pretty good family life
I
too,
did.
right? Like
I
you didn't
did.
have
I had a
daddy
very,
issues and
I
that kind of
mean,
stuff.
who among us, Blair? Come
The
on.
average, sure, sure, sure.
Didn't
Every
have
kid
any
deserves
might be a
therapy.
stretch. I had issues. I've written about them in other books, but
Okay, sure.
relative to a lot of people, I had a loving family. I had a like secure attachment to my parents.
You didn't see enough to say that's why it
Right,
happened, I guess
exactly.
is what
Like
I'm
there
saying. Yeah.
wasn't like a great departure there. But I could see back in as early as my youngest friendships where we were sort of with other girls, we were enacting these. It was actually the sort of like prototype for the maelstrom, right? Where it was
Mhm.
this like super heightened, super passionate, making big promises, very dramatic, very possessive, very intense sort of relationships where the stakes felt very, very high and they were very consuming before they were even ever like physically eroticized, right? They were
Yeah.
very romantic, very passionate,
Yeah.
relationships.
Did you know at the time that you were gay? That like,
I
were
did.
you
I
identify as a
knew
lesbian?
I knew that I wasn't straight, and I think part of
Okay.
this is because my mom isn't straight, she's bisexual, and so it was always presented to me as, like, whatever, and to me, like, I was like, "Isn't everybody bisexual?" Like, that would make sense. I don't which obviously isn't true, but I presumed that.
At the time you just did,
Yeah,
yeah.
I was like, "I'm probably not straight."
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah.
it's very clear it was also very clear, I think, to everyone around me that I was definitely not straight. Um, but then I had both relationships with men and women as a young
Yeah.
person, and, yeah, there were a few of them where I went back multiple ones I didn't even include in the book because you only need
Hmm.
one example of some things. It would have been
Yeah.
really repetitive as my inventory was, very, very repetitive, but there were a lot of relationships where I went back and I thought, "Oh, no, wait, I really did this thing that I'm now seeing I've done for a lot of my adulthood, where I sort of people pleased and capitulated to what the other person wanted or what they thought they
Mhm.
wanted, and was kind of this, like, trying to be this perfect partner until I
You were yielding to
yeah.
your single
I was
obsession,
yielding to
right?
my single necessity, which was keeping my partner happy, being the perfect object of affection, and then I would burn out because actually I was a person with lots of other interests and obsessions and was very independent, and I would start to sort of hate them, and
Yeah.
I was so afraid of conflict that I would basically, like, bail out of the relationship. Sometimes I would ghost them. Sometimes I would break up with them ceremoniously and never speak to them again. Sometimes I would just vaporize, and
Yeah.
we didn't have a word for that at the time. There was no ghosting, because there was no
Yeah, that's
internet,
pretty
so
new.
nobody knew that anybody else was really doing it. There were no apps.
Yeah.
And I realized that I had even gotten the information years later. I had gone back and assumed that it would be okay with those people, and they pretty uniformly said to me "Oh no, you basically ruined my life for a few years." I was
Oh, yeah.
totally devastated. And I was like,
That's part of taking accountability. It reminds me of your addiction stuff.
Yeah.
Like you went through Alcoholics Anonymous,
Yeah.
I presume. So the 12 steps is about taking an inventory and also making reparations.
Absolutely.
With
That's
people from the past.
a big part of how I had the idea to do the inventory. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm a big list maker anyway.
Yeah.
But I had really transformed my life through 12-step for drug and alcohol addiction. And so I had definitely turned over the log of my own behavior to see all the bugs that were underneath and gone and made amends for that. So so this was sort of based on that model, right?
Yeah. You had a lot of extra time. Now you're not in these relationships. You could research stuff, you could study stuff, and you bring up this famous text from 1184, Andreas Capellanus. I'm going to just guess that that's how you say
Your
it.
guess is as good as mine.
This is from The Art of Courtly Love. Speaking of lists, this is some of the stuff that's just floating around in the cultural air that you and I and many people just imbibed about what we think about relationships. So I thought I'd have you read some of those excerpts
Sure.
that you have in the list here. Yeah.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, when I came upon this, I thought, oh, interesting that my first model for romantic relationships was based on this very, very old and crazy list.
Yeah.
Here we go. He who is not jealous cannot love. A true lover does not desire to embrace and love anyone except his beloved. When made public, love rarely endures. The easy attainment of love makes it of little value. Difficulty of attainment makes it prized. If love diminishes, it quickly fails and rarely revives. A true lover considers nothing good except what he thinks will please his beloved. A true lover is constantly and without intermission possessed by the thought of his beloved. I mean, it's actually still shocking to me. And as I was just reading it, I was like, oh man, I actually can see how a few of these stuck around. And more recently, I've had to actually sort of debunk them.
To me, I see him treating love like this sort of magical spell out in the world rather than, I would compare love to gardening. Like it's something that you do and you cultivate and you get your hands in the dirt. And he's just like, no, love is this thing out there that you then sort of takes over you. So you got to be super jealous. You would never think anyone else is attractive. Which says, if you ever get a crush on somebody, you should start questioning whether you love the person you're with, which is so silly and so stupid.
Do. It's totally crazy. It's I now have a relationship where we can talk about our crushes, and it feels so shocking to me because I really, for years, had this very immature idea that I really should be obsessed with my person. I should never want anyone else. I should constantly be trying to please them. I should be very possessive and apparently secretive. It's just so toxic. It's the worst. This just sounds like a list of red flags, right?
Yes, and the list of red flags precedes one of the funniest lines in the book, which I will bleep out for everyone, but I will say it to you, which is where you say, "Be still, my beating," which elicited a pretty big laugh.
My wife read that, and she was like, "You clown! You would never say this in person." I was like, "I know," but it was very true to me in the moment because I do understand that there is this. Because this was the first model of what's hot and romantic, there is something, and I think this is what happened when I was 32 and I met my lover in the maelstrom, and she acted exactly like this and was actively this is how we should be.
Yeah, that's love.
There was a young part of me that was just oh, swoon, it just seemed like all of my very young preserved fantasies come true, even as the adult of me was uh-oh.
And you took your inventory and you actually ended up sharing it with a spiritual director and also with a therapist.
Yeah.
So originally you were writing it for yourself, then you shared it. And I wondered, what different things did sharing it with those people do? Because a spiritual director has one mode of working with people therapeutically, and a therapist has professional kind of guidelines that they follow. So what did you get out of both of those instances of sharing?
Oh, so much. It was such a helpful exercise. I really have just experienced over the course of most of my adult life that it is, you know, so much of the insights I have gotten about myself and my experience come through sharing them with other people. Like by nature, I'm
Hmm.
such a secretive person, and secrecy for me enormously inhibits growth. It's really hard for
Hmm.
me to really have a kind of accurate self-appraisal without allowing other people to see me. And these two people were
I feel
people.
that way too.
Yeah, I think most adults sort of figure that out. It's like we
I know people that hide though, like, I don't
it's
know. I
comforting.
don't know if most
It
do.
feels safe to
Maybe
hide.
I feel lazy. I feel like it's because I'm just like, I don't have the time and
Ah,
energy to,
you tell
to
me.
not just.
Yeah, but it's hard to being seen is scary because other people see things we don't for the very reason that it is
That's true.
valuable is the very reason why it's terrifying. So I think,
Yeah.
especially when
Good
people
point.
have a lot of shame, they're afraid of what other people will see or point out, or that people will see them and then be like, whoa, gross.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Right?
Yeah, and your partner that you live with is going to see a lot more. He's
Oh,
going to
yeah.
know you a lot in
Sometimes
different ways than you know
my
yourself.
wife and I have a little sort of discourse in our household about like, oh my God, please stop perceiving me. I can't take it anymore. Like, I just need like no more observations, please. I'm at my limit for the day. I know so much more about myself than I want to know because she's here to tell
Yeah.
me. But yeah, so when I shared the inventory with my spiritual director, who is like a mentor and dear friend of mine, who's very honest, very straight shooter,
Hmm.
I was really looking to them for more of like my part, my complicity. What did I do here that
Hmm.
I'm not seeing that I can change? And what they said was the absolutely resounding, horrifying phrase that I don't think they came up with, but that they were the first person to ever say to me, which is people pleasing is people using. Because, they had said, you're a
Mm-hmm.
user. When I hear this,
Yeah.
I hear that you used these people. And I was like, how can I be a user when I was a people pleaser? And they said, Melissa, people pleasing is people using. You did
Yeah.
that. You pleased them to soothe yourself because it made you feel safe. It wasn't about the best thing for either of you. It was just what made you feel safe. And I was like, oh, crap. I knew it
Mm-hmm.
was true. I knew it was true. And it was also it was like depressing, but also really galvanizing because I was like, oh, okay, I can stop. I can stop.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not easy, but that's something I can actually work on, right? I can practice doing something differently. And then when I shared it with my therapist was like, as therapists are, much more interested in the sort of like integration and healing. And so when I shared it with her, I was really able to step into how it felt to have hurt all those people, like how it felt to have betrayed my best ex, right? Like someone I
Mm-hmm.
dearly, dearly loved. And I just didn't like, I desperately did not want to hurt her. And I had gone about our breakup in the most cowardly way. And, it's like I've gone through a lot of breakups. When you're going through a breakup, it's so helpful to have a crush on someone else or some kind of anesthesia
A
because it is
bridge.
so
Yeah.
painful to hurt someone that you love, right? And I had anesthetized myself so thoroughly that in many cases I had never really felt the pain of having hurt those people, right? And I had never
Mm.
really sat with it. And to sit with it was quite devastating and also like purifying. Like it was really good to
Yeah.
finally feel those feelings that I had been really sort of carrying around in my body, I think, ever since. And so my therapist encouraged me to communicate with those parts of myself. Like,
Hmm.
what do you want to say to the part of you that is devastated about this, and to really step into the caring, integrated adult part of myself that could be more responsible and more loving and more brave in relationships.
And you were in a really good place to start doing that because, as you write at one point here, you say, up until then, I had not gone a day in 20 years without entertaining the ways that I did or should or would or could appeal to other people
Mhm.
and conform to their desires.
Mhm.
Like, you finally were able to step out of that mindset of being completely directed towards others.
Mhm.
And the irony, as the spiritual director pointed out, is you were doing that and it was all self-directed.
That's right.
I think that's why it's so hard to see in
Mhm.
ourselves,
Mhm.
because it's an illusion that we are living toward others, but it really is all about ourselves. And so many self-help books, I think,
Mhm.
encourage that kind of mentality. I think
Mhm.
positive thinking type stuff are like, it's all self-directed.
It's true. Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I think that was at the very core of the book is like this very nuanced, like teasing apart of motive
Uh-huh.
and intention and responsibility to really try to get to a practice of love that is actually generous and loving, that
Yeah.
really is about the other, that acknowledges all of our investment in the self, doesn't try to hide from it in this fantasy of like being good, right? And it
Yeah.
really acknowledges taking responsibility for ourselves so that we can truly be generous and truly see and consider other people. And that means saying no to them sometimes. It means
Yeah.
displeasing them sometimes. And this is like, it's not like a sexy idea. It's not like a marketable idea. It's really like,
Yeah.
you're really gonna get down in there.
I know. I feel that on my podcast. This
Yeah,
is the stuff I'm
yeah,
trying to talk about. And it's like, how do I put that in like a TikTok reel or like
yeah.
a, it doesn't fit.
Because it is truly radical, right? It is really,
Yeah.
really radical and so liberating, and I really believe has the power to, like, transform on a really global level. Like, for
Oh,
people
yeah.
to take responsibility for their own emotions and needs allows
Yep.
us to be loving and generous in ways that really could transform our societies, right? Like, you see it operating in relationships, in families, in institutions, in governments,
Hmm.
like, really at every level. It's like so much destruction is caused because people don't acknowledge and take responsibility for their own feelings. I see it, at work all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. You're trying to uncover this like toxic dependence and replace it with not just independence. Because I think to me, that's the people, when people realize there's a problem, a lot of times they go to the independence thing as
Totally,
though
it's
that
just the
is.
opposite.
But you're saying
Yeah.
there's an
That's
interdependence
right.
that you're trying to get to.
That's right. Because independence, I was great at that too. Like my great fantasy, in some ways, I think the fantasy that I had intermittently during my celibacy and then, had in other relationships where it was sort of like, I'm going to go live in a tower. I'll just never do any of this ever again. Like that actually seemed
Yeah.
more appealing to me, but it's this binary. It's just the binary black and white thinking. It's never realistic. It's never generous to the self or other people. There really is no escape from the hard work of like interdependence and like navigating intimacy. It is really,
Yeah.
really hard. And it is, for me, like the only way.
And the trick is it does still include giving of yourself
It does.
and you just have to assess why you're doing that and how much you're giving and differentiating from the partner that you're with because there are still sacrifices that you
Mhm.
make. Your book this is where it's so hard to like to just articulate it all. The book lays it out so well, but it's this idea of you're not preaching this isolated independent thing. You're talking about the interconnection,
Mhm.
which does require some sacrifice and give and
Mhm.
take, and like
Mhm.
the relationship you're in right now with your partner, where
Yeah.
you said like you can talk to each other about your crushes and not have to
Mhm.
necessarily feel threatened about it, or sometimes you're not going to be able to read when you had that plan because something else
Yeah.
comes up. So,
Yeah.
but also
Exactly.
sometimes you need to say, hey, I need this time to read. Like both
Totally.
of those things can be true.
Totally. Yeah, it's really funny. You just made me think about my wife and I have had to navigate, like, this is a really minor thing, but it's totally part of it, where like at the end of the day, I'm like a morning person and I like to go to bed and then I like to have 30 to 60 minutes to read before I fall asleep, and I don't want anyone to talk to me or really touch me. And it's my decompression. And she's a night owl, so sort of revs up and always gets like a wind at night. And will
Yeah,
sometimes
that's
like
me
come
and my
into the
wife.
bedroom and like start a deep conversation with me, and I'll be like, "Ah, what are you doing? This is my wind down time." And it took like many years for us to like navigate being like, okay, sometimes when I feel open to it, I can choose to put my book down and like give her my
Yeah,
attention, and we can have a nice interaction before bed. And then
yeah,
sometimes I need to say, "Sweetie, I can't do it tonight." And she'll be like, "Okay." And she'll go direct that energy elsewhere. But it's a choice, right? Where I think in the past,
yeah.
my partners would want to talk and I would put my book down every single time. And then after about 2.5 years of that, I would be like, I think I hate this person. And the only way for me to read at night is to end this relationship.
Yeah.
Which is like, whoa, buddy.
I'm choosing my
Yeah,
books.
it's just like all or nothing. And that doesn't work when it comes to intimacy. It really doesn't.
No.
It's not sustainable.
That's Melissa Febos talking about her new book, The Dry Season, a memoir of pleasure in a year without sex. Her other books you might have heard of include Whip Smart, Abandon Me, Girlhood, and Bodywork. And she's won more awards and critical acclaim than I have time to say right now. She's been published in places like the Paris Review, the New Yorker, The Believer, McSweeney's, the New York Times Magazine. And she earned her MFA degree from Sarah Lawrence College. Currently, she teaches in the nonfiction writing program as a professor at the University of Iowa. Speaking of teaching, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your work on the art of memoir, because you haven't just written memoirs, you've written books about writing memoirs,
Mhm.
Body Work, The Radical Power of Personal Narrative. And that book talks about the emotional, psychological, and physical work of writing intimately. And we've kind of addressed some of the emotional things that you were going through and maybe some of the psychological. But I think people might be surprised to hear that there are physical elements of writing intimately about your life. How did that apply here to this book?
That's really interesting. I mean, I think, some of this is not explicitly in the book, but I think that this book is the closest in voice and style to sort of me in the world than any
Hmm.
previous book that I've written. And the reason for that is because over the last, let's say, 5 years, I mean, really 10 years, but 5 years, I went through like a huge change in my life where I basically sort of redefined my relationship with my body. And, it's all connected, which is something that like I've always known, right? And
Hmm.
seemed also pretty separate from the way I ran my life, which was like I lead a life of the mind. I treat my body like a machine that I own. And I basically took terrible care of it. I did not feel integrated in my relationship with my body, and I would sort of write at all hours, deprive myself of sleep, drive long distances, traveling all of the time, exercising only as a means of either sort of controlling the shape of my body or for the sort of endorphins, mostly for the endorphins,
Mm-hmm.
without thinking about the ways that those practices and those ways of living affected my body or how the way I treated my body affected my emotional life. And as someone who trades in emotional insight into experience, it was a significant area of neglect, right? I really was like, speaking of like living in extremes, I really had sort of exiled my body as like not
Hmm.
a major concern, which was in many ways also, of course, dependent on the privilege of having a well body, having an able body, which I totally took for granted.
Yeah.
And some years ago, I that changed, and I had a series of sort of pretty catastrophic back spasms and a spinal
Mm.
injury, and mostly from the ways that I had treated my body from running kind of addictively for most of my adult life. And I was pretty severely disabled for a couple of years intermittently. And that ironically, I was writing my craft book about memoir, Body Work, at the time.
Hmm.
And so I was like convalescing or like, in weird positions because I couldn't stand or sit, writing
Right.
this book about memoir and at the same time really figuring out how to be a writer, to sort of live my life in a way that made space for a healthy relationship with my body. And I think, it had an indelible effect on my work that I did sort of basically overhaul and change my entire lifestyle, from the amount of time I work to when I work to how my desk is arranged. I'm standing on a treadmill desk right now. Um, and I really basically sort of got in touch with my body and learned to take care of myself in a different way. And that made me so much more compassionate towards myself and other people, which radically affects the way that I write memoir, which is writing
Yeah.
stories about myself and other people, right?
Yeah, I love your like definition of the autobiographical writing as a form of intellectualization and aestheticization. So there's like brainy thinking about stuff, beauty, aesthetics
Mhm.
that leads ultimately to a confrontation with emotional truth.
Right.
And I hadn't read a lot of memoirs before I started this podcast project, and I used to have this idea of them as kind of not worth my time. I thought they were like navel gazing, or people would be like, "Oh, so brave," and I was like, "I don't need a so brave person right now." Like, right? These are sort of the
Yep.
common tropes of memoir.
A friend and I actually have a refrain, just like a running joke that's just so brave, where we'll be
Yeah,
like at a reading and we'll look at each other and just be like, "So brave." 'Cause it
exactly.
just feels I mean, and of course, like, there are writers who are really brave, like, I have to be really brave,
Sure.
but it just feels like a shorthand for, like, is it good art? Do
Yeah.
you like it? Is it entertaining? Or is it just so brave, Like, is it just, like, kinda pitiful?
Yeah, because there could be some so brave stuff that also they're not writers. Like, it's not well written, the craft isn't there, and that's fine. We need that. We need, people can tell their stories. It doesn't mean people shouldn't tell their stories, but the way that you're teaching people to write and think about writing and the way that you do it yourself really does combine that intellectualization, the aestheticization, and ultimately this confrontation with emotional truth. And the way that you stack time, folding time, I guess, is the metaphor that you use, that you're folding time to see patterns. And you became it seemed to me you're kind of obsessed with these beguines, these like religious women who kind of struck off on their own way back in the day. And I didn't expect like a religious angle to come up in the book, but they seem to play a really important part though. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't expect it either. I mean, that is so fun. It's one of my favorite parts of writing in general and writing memoir specifically is that you think you know what the story is, right? Because I remember it's my story, but I absolutely don't. Like, living something does not mean that you understand it or even that you're aware of what the story is or what role you played in it. It's like everything can be a surprise. But because I also include sort of research and a kind of intertextual, like sort of searching element to mine, there are huge surprises from like Wile E. Coyote to this like 1100 text, The Art of Courtly Love, to the Beguines, who were, as you said, these religious laywomen who were kind of get talked about like nuns, but they were not nuns. They were not under
they weren't
church
official.
rule. And
Yeah.
they basically were like separatists who, like religious separatists who sort of abandoned their lives. They often abandoned like unhappy marriages or lives of abuse or, there were just not very good life options for women at the time. They sort of cropped up in the Low Countries of Europe in the 13th century, and then there was a resurgence in the 16th century. But in the 13th century, they would sort of buy these properties outside of major cities, like in kind of gross, unpopulated areas. And they would buy like a big set of buildings, build a giant wall around it, and they would sort of start a company of some kind. They were financially independent. They would sort of worship and preach, which was illegal at the time. And they would basically sort of work as kind of social workers in their communities. They lived.
They opted out of the patriarchy.
They opted out of the patriarchy. They opted out of like the economy, even of the cities where they lived. They opted out of like traditional gender roles. They opted out in like really radical ways that actually I found both sort of humbling and heartening, because I was like, what if these ladies in the Middle Ages who had like zero rights could live these principles of interdependence and like align themselves with their deepest held beliefs, like spiritual, social, interpersonal, I can do a little bit better in the 21st century. Like I can do a bit better, I think.
Yeah. I can't remember if they sought converts. Did they go out and evangelize, or did people just gravitate to them?
I think it was really sort of like, like there's a slogan in 12-step that's like attraction, not promotion. They don't evangelize or try. And I think the Beguines were attraction, not promotion. But they didn't have to evangelize. Like, it was very, very appealing for a lot of women. I mean, they spread like wildfire, right? Because it's like...
Yeah. The church eventually tamped down on it.
Yeah, they ended up burning a lot of them as heretics and like shutting them down and forcing them to either rejoin society or join abbeys of actual nuns. Because these, when I look at my life, I was reading about the Beguines, and when I first learned of them, I thought, oh my God, like, think about all of the people I am in community with, all of these like women writers and artists and queer community and activists. And like in the Middle Ages, like all of these people would be expected to marry some guy that's probably someone else chose and then just churn out babies and basically work as a domestic servant for the rest of your life. Like, what would we have done?
Yeah.
And it was like really obvious that we would all have run away to the Beguinage. Like, that would definitely have been it.
Now, I ask you about evangelizing because that's an interesting part of your book about how you went about talking about your experiment while it was going on. So like in the very beginning, you told your mom, as you mentioned, a psychotherapist, and her first thing was like, "Ooh, be careful how you bring that up, because like 3 months, not a real hero there, buddy." Like
everyone's going to laugh at you.
Yeah. And then it would sometimes come up at dinner, like you might mention it, and you'd notice all the attention would be like, whoosh, like people like, ooh, I want to hear about this. So, but you weren't about going out and like proclaiming the truths of it, but your book kind of does that now. So that's where I wanted to ask you about, like, throughout the process, there wasn't a sense of evangelism. Do you feel like the book is?
No, I wouldn't say that the book that was not my goal at all when writing the book. But, you know, like everything I have ever written about in memoirs and personal essays, this subject matter started out as something I thought was a personal problem. I thought,
Hmm.
I have a messed up relationship to relationships. I don't know how I got it. I really
Hmm.
need to like change myself in this way. I have a specific me problem, right? And then when I would it would come up incidentally while I was doing it, so many people, it was really quite shocking. So many people were like, tell me more. And they would have this
Yeah.
look of eagerness and dread because I could tell they
Mm.
knew it was something that they should probably do or they had the same problem. And I thought, oh my
Mm.
God, I am not alone in this. So many more people. But like, we weren't talking about it, which feels shocking because like we talk about relationships all the time, but the tenor of those relationships was not the tenor of the conversations I was having during my celibacy. Mostly people were complaining about dating or they were complaining about not being in relationships or
Right.
not
People that would
finding
want
the right
to,
person or
they
complaining.
want the opposite of celibacy and they're not
Yeah,
getting it.
exactly. And then when I started to realize that people were really hungry for a different kind of conversation and they too felt alone, whether they were sort of involuntarily in nonstop relationships or involuntarily never in relationships,
Hmm.
they were really, really interested in the project of sort of trying to change my relationship to love. And so when I went through this experience and I did successfully change myself and had all of these insights, I thought, I don't wanna recruit people. I don't think that's possible, first of all. This is not something you're gonna recruit people if they're not already interested, but I don't believe in
Yeah.
that anyway. But I know that there are lots of people out there who are just kind of caught in a cycle and feeling baffled by it, feeling alone in it, feeling ashamed of it, not knowing what the first step might be. And so I thought, "You know what? I'm gonna lay out what I have learned through writing this book and through the
Yeah.
experience of celibacy so that other people can find it as a touchstone if they are already having this experience." So it's really for the
Yeah.
people who are already in the club but don't know it yet.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I think just the process you went through, I think prepared you well to be that kind of I would say a journey partner
Yeah.
rather than an instructor,
Yeah.
right? And I thought the book was just going to have a chapter about like how food was more tasty now that you were celibate and how movies were more interesting. Like, I don't know, just like shallow stuff like that. And you do talk about some
Mhm.
increased like sensual pleasures for sure. That's there.
Yeah.
But what really stood out was you call it a spilling kind of emotionality. That's what you say. And so even in these conversations where you're talking to
Mm.
others about your celibacy, it seemed like you were able to be more emotionally available to those conversations because you were experimenting, going through this process of celibacy.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, I was more available to sort of recognize that sort of new information about the people I was in community with, but I was also more available for every single kind of relationship, like my
Yeah.
friendships, my relationships with my students, my relationship with nature, with my
Hmm.
work, with my family. Like I really became more available to the world,
Yeah.
you know?
And then the project then had to become, if you were going to re-enter into the world of like relationships
Mhm.
again, how to take that with you and not fall back into those same patterns, right? And I wondered if, you described some of that in the book toward the end, but I wondered if you feel now, you're years removed from it, if you feel pressure to keep succeeding, to like actualize the lessons from the book, or worries about like, am I a hypocrite because I wrote this lesson out in the book and I'm not living by it? Do you know what I mean? Is there pressure for having put it out there so publicly?
I would say actually no, not from the
Hmm.
book. I mean, would I be embarrassed if I had like a relapse and went back to like flirting with everybody and being messy and absolutely, but like I don't there's no
Yeah.
danger of that happening. Like there really is like no going back. The
Yeah.
pressure I feel doesn't come from having made it public or the book itself. The pressure comes from having actually raised my own standard for living, right? Like
Hmm.
one of the texts that I quote from in this book and have quoted from in other books of mine because it's so important for me is Audre Lorde's essay, Uses of the Erotic as Power. And in that
Hmm.
essay, she defines the erotic not as a sexual element, but as basically what I'm sort of writing about in this book is this way of being in the world and in oneself and in every relationship and activity as fully and spiritually present as possible. And that once you begin to do that in your life, it becomes impossible to go backward because it feels terrible, right? That once you
Yeah.
know and you have a frame of reference how
Hmm.
it feels to really be in your relationships, to really like consider yourself and consider other people and have a higher expectation for the quality of connection and presence and activity in all those areas of your life, you really can't tolerate it being lower, right? And so, like, for
Hmm.
instance, in my
Sounds
marriage,
like a religious conversion.
it does, and in some ways it is. I mean, it's definitely a conversion to a higher standard of living and
Hmm.
presence, right? It's like a different definition of love, and so were I or in the moments where I have, of course, like, slipped back into old ways of being, and I think this mostly happens I guess it happens throughout my life t to small degrees, but most radically, I think, in my marriage, because I really had to put, like, the rubber to the road in my marriage, and there have been times where I've slipped into, like, the people-pleasing kind of manipulations of my
Hmm.
past, and it has, like, been horrible. It has hurt my
Yeah.
relationship. It has made me feel terrible about myself. It has also just kind of stalled me out. It just, like, doesn't feel right anymore. It used to feel bad in some ways, but also it's just what I did. It was like the air that I breathe, and now it's not. And so when I do it, it doesn't feel right, and it causes disruptions and pretty immediate consequences in my life. So it's kind of like, I was a cigarette smoker for a long time when I was younger. Now, once in a while, I'll be like, "Ooh, I used to love smoking. Give me a draggier cigarette." And it's awful. I hate it. It makes me cough. I feel gross. I'm like, "Ugh." And that's kind of how it feels, right? So the book is more
Yeah.
like separate from that. It's not anyone else's perception that keeps me changed. It's
Yeah.
really my own affect.
Well, people will find out as they read why the 3-month thing didn't work out. It's basically like you weren't ready yet.
Yeah.
So you kept prolonging the deadline.
Yep.
And it ended up being a year.
Mhm.
Not that you set out to have it be that, but that's how it ended up. And at the end, you described this ritual that you undertook. You
Mhm.
ended your celibacy commitment with a ritual at the ocean. I thought it would be nice if you take us there. And
Sure. Yeah, at the end, I sort of realized right around the year mark that the need for a deadline had gone away. And I had
hmm,
needed the deadline, as I said before, because I have a real allegiance to deadlines. I want to meet them. And otherwise, there was such a strong pull back towards my own behavior. There was a kind of momentum, a lifelong momentum that was going to pull me back. And at the end of the year, I realized, I think it was actually before the end of the year, that I didn't wanna go back anymore, that I was so
hmm,
content and so thriving in every area of my life, like, I didn't miss being in relationships or rarely missed it, and I really felt so happy that the question was, like, "Am I ever going to want to?" Rather than, like,
hmm,
"How do I avoid running back into my old
hmm.
habits and behaviors?" And I'm a person who loves ceremonies, so, so when I realized that there was no need for a deadline, I stopped setting one, and I sort of felt like,
Hmm,
I graduated, right?
hmm,
And I just decided to sort of step into the rest of my life. And if I wanted to be in another relationship, I was free to try to do so in a very different way. I had been very pragmatic about the ways I wanted to sort of conduct that experience if and when I decided to, but I wasn't going to go looking for it. I was just going to sort of keep living without a specific project of celibacy. I wasn't technically celibate anymore. And I just kind of moved into the rest of my life.
Yeah. And this ceremony, you took this list with you.
Yeah, I took my list and I rode the train to Coney Island and I dug a little hole in the sand and I burned the list. And it felt like
And what was on that list?
the list was it was the list of the was it the list of the person who I wanted to be? It was the list of, um I think it was the list of the ways that I didn't want to be anymore in the
Yeah.
world, right? Like, I had made a bunch of
Yeah.
lists, and this was the one that I was like, "I am stepping into the new reality.
Yeah.
I really truly felt changed, right? And so I felt like it wasn't a ceremonial, like, in burning this, I now free myself. It was like I had freed myself, and I wanted to
Yeah.
mark that occasion, right?
It was a celebration rather than
It
some sort of
was,
promise or
yeah, it
something.
was like I'm a
Huh.
very sort of ceremonial person, which comes up a lot
Yeah.
in the books, and so
Were there any secret, I'm not going to ask you what they are, but were there any other, this seemed like a sacred moment and you shared it with us. Were there other sacred moments throughout the process that you decided not to put in the book? And I won't necessarily ask what they are. I just wonder how much you kept to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, the great surprise, both I think to the writer and certainly to the reader of writing memoir, is that you have to leave almost everything out. Like, 300 pages is not as long as it seems. I had a lot to do in the pages of this book. And so, yeah, there was a lot that I left out. I mean, I think it's like safe to assume of most memoirs, certainly of my work, that any sort of high topography moment of insight or drama in the book, there were probably like at least 5 to 10 other experiences that were similar to that one.
But were any of them like sacred though, that you're like, this one's for me. I'm not putting it in there.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. There were definitely
Cool.
moments. There were definitely moments, especially moments that involved other people, because
Yeah, you had to navigate.
I am willing to share more of my own private special moments, but with other people, I have learned to be much more protective
Yeah.
of those
And you're using
experiences.
pseudonyms and stuff. and
Totally.
you kind of talk about that. But yeah, that makes sense, especially that those moments especially would be held back.
Yeah.
That's Melissa Febos. We're talking about her terrific book, The Dry Season, a memoir of pleasure in a year without sex, and we'll be right back with regrets, challenges, and surprises after this. Hey, everybody, it's me, Blair, again. I'm just wondering, it's a new year, but how did the holidays go for you? I'll be honest, holidays can be a bit stressful for me. The song is There's No Place Like Home for the Holidays. And I mean, to some people that can sound a bit threatening, actually, that there's no place like home, which is why maybe it's hard to be there. It's not terribly hard for me, but, I don't want to over-exaggerate or anything, but some people really struggle with the idea of going home for the holidays. And, I saw Mel Robbins wrote a New York Times editorial about this, how we all just kind of need to forget our own traumas and just sidle up next to our racist uncles or whatever. And I'd have to say that the lack of nuance in that piece wasn't particularly helpful to me. I got a lot better advice from a podcast that you might like. The podcast is called What Your Therapist Thinks, and they had a really good episode about setting healthy boundaries with family. The episode was called A Guide to Surviving the Holidays. And with apologies, I'm sorry this recommendation comes a little bit late, but there's always next year, right? So, or you can listen and see what might have gone better if you had listened to it beforehand. I'll tell you a little bit more about the podcast, though. I think people who listen to Relationscapes might really connect with this show. What Your Therapist Thinks is a mental health show where actual licensed therapists are opening up about what they're really thinking. And if you haven't ever been in therapy, or you haven't been to therapy in a while, like me, and you want to get back there, the show will give you an inside look at what therapists are really thinking about questions that you might be afraid to ask them. Topics like performance anxiety or why people cheat, infidelity, what people pleasing is like and how to navigate it, what's up with ketamine therapy, and more. And two things make this a standout show for me. The first thing is that co-host Felicia Keller-Boyle is a licensed somatic therapist. And I know that no specialty is perfect, but I do put a lot of stock in the words of people who've put in the work and who maintain their credential, right? They have professional expectations, guidelines, and ethics that they follow. So I think for that reason, it's just on a little bit higher of a level than a lot of shows that talk about mental health that aren't brought to us through the lens of what specialists can bring. But also, because no specialty is perfect, her co-host, Christy Plantinga, is sort of a stand-in for people like us. We're not therapists, we're not trained in that way, but we're deeply interested in mental health, and she brings that kind of perspective. So as co-hosts, it works really well. They're kind of a dynamic duo. I love the conversations that they have each episode with other licensed mental health professionals. And the show is sponsored by BetterTherapists.com, which Christy founded. This is a directory that kind of vets mental health professionals so that if you're seeking therapy, you can focus on best fit. The second thing I really love about this show is how intersectional it is. It has a lot of queer and non-traditional voices and perspectives in it. And I think cisgender folks like me have a ton to learn from these perspectives. So those are the two big reasons. You have licensed professionals and you have a great intersectional lens. And as always, by the way, Relationscapes is brought to you by me. I don't have any paid sponsorships or anything right now, but Felicia and Christy reached out because they thought our audiences might enjoy each other's shows, and I agreed. So doing a promo swap like this is a great way to grow our audiences and also introduce our listeners to shows that we kind of believe in. So again, if it sounds interesting to you, you can check out What Your Therapist Thinks wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, Felicia and Christy. Keep up the great work over there. All right, and now back to Relationscapes. We're back with Melissa Febos, award-winning and highly acclaimed author of many books, including Girlhood, Bodyworks, Whip Smart, and her latest book, The Dry Season. And now it's time for Regrets, Challenges, and Surprises. Melissa, is there anything that you'd change about this book now that it's out? Or what kind of obstacles did you have to overcome to get this one done? Or what kind of things did you learn as you were putting it together? Any big revelations? What caught you off guard?
I'm going to go with surprises, because it is just, it's sort of like we started this conversation with you talking about how there are writers who go out there and are like, this is a cool idea for a memoir. This is a project I can undertake in service of a memoir. But like, when I tell you that I never plan to write another memoir or another personal thing, I'm like, I'm going to go write some fantastical fiction, or like, I always have another plan. And even when it occurred to me that I might write about this experience, I thought, cool, I'll write a nonfiction book about celibate ladies across history, all of these amazing figures that I became obsessed with. And maybe I'll put like a little bit of my own experience, like interstitially between the chapters, but I'm going to write about the Beguines and Hildegard von Bingen and the Dahomey Amazons and all of these amazing people throughout history, right? And then I started to try to write that, and my own story was like, hey, girl, hi. I've actually got some things I want to say. And I was like, no, not you. And it really, I fought it for a little bit. I was like, I really don't think there's a whole book there. Like, I really wasn't planning on writing a memoir.
Wow.
And like on the other side of having written the memoir, it's just amazing to me. It's just like, I think that's part of my creative process, is that I have to set a trap for myself and then walk into it, because I'll never just decide to write a memoir.
You're your own roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote?
True. They hunt me down and they trap me, and then I just have to yield. I have to surrender.
Well, Melissa, the book is, it is a surprise. That's a huge surprise to hear that, because it's an absolutely outstanding book. I love this book.
Thank you.
And I just want to say thanks for putting it out there, and also thanks for joining us to talk about it.
This has been so fun. What a fun premise for a podcast. What a fun conversation. And thank you for being such a close and careful and generous reader. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Relationscapes. I've got a bit of a favor to ask. If you'll please take a minute to rate and review Relationscapes in Apple Podcasts. Just open the app, search for Relationscapes, scroll down, you'll see the ratings and reviews. Leave a review right there. Here's a new review I just got from Indigo Jack. They say, this is the only podcast I know where you really get to listen to and focus on the experiences of a wide variety of people having a wide variety of experiences in this roller coaster life. It builds very relevant skills for our divided and very binary society. I always learn so much, and I haven't missed an episode since the beginning. Well, that's amazing. Hey, Indigo Jack, I think you're my first completist. My completist. Let's go. Yes, that's right. We have a Relationscapes completist. They've heard every episode. Thank you so much. So, folks, go rate and review the show in Apple Podcasts. I also challenge you to become a completist. Do like Indigo Jack did. Listen to all the episodes. You can also rate the show in Spotify, by the way. All right. Mates of State provides our theme song. I'm your host, Blair Hodges, a journalist in Salt Lake City, and I'll see you next time.